Welcome everyone to this brief tour of AutoRecords for M-Files. Before we get into the demo, we'll spend just a few seconds on what AutoRecords is and how it works. AutoRecords is an extension of M-Files that provides records management capabilities for content that's stored in the M-Files repository. Using the M-Files IML connectors, the features of AutoRecords can also be extended to other repositories, making it a platform that can be used for full enterprise records management. As we explore AutoRecords, you'll see features designed to address many common issues that records managers face. For example, it helps to ensure compliance by automatically classifying records so nothing accidentally gets missed and slips through the cracks. The automated processing dramatically reduces the records manager's workload and helps prevent errors, but at the same time, it doesn't impact documents that are going through workflow. Importantly, AutoRecords is not a cookie-cutter records management solution. Your records policies don't have to be changed to fit the software. Instead, the software is configurable, flexible, and extensible so that each organization is assured of a solution that fits their exact records management needs. And finally, AutoRecords is designed to work with the business and deliver capabilities for audits, legal holds, and reporting requirements. The way AutoRecords works is that it accesses content stored in a repository and then applies retention policies to the content based on some rules. The result is that the content has some additional information attached to it which identifies the retention policies that apply. AutoRecords will then process the content in the repository based on the retention policy that's been applied. Let's take a closer look at how M-Files and AutoRecords work together to deliver these records management features. M-Files handles all of the document creation and content management tasks such as creating content, versioning, metadata assignments, and updates. The M-Files artificial intelligence tools can also be used to help discover and assign metadata automatically. Once the document is created with the appropriate metadata, AutoRecords takes over. Using simple rules that records managers create and maintain, the content is automatically assigned to a retention category based on the metadata that's associated to the content. Once a retention category has been assigned, AutoRecords events are scheduled to handle disposition of the content. These events can be scheduled based on metadata changes, dates, or file versions. Finally, on the scheduled date of the event, the appropriate disposition actions are executed and logged for auditing purposes. So now let's take a look at these features in action. We're going to start the demo as Kimberly, who works in the HR department. Kimberly is not a records manager and she's going about her daily work. The first thing Kimberly is going to do is she's going to create a new document. For the sake of this demo, we'll use a standard document class. As you can see here, I've allowed Kimberly access to the AutoRecords group heading, but she only has permission to the expiration date. As we'll see in a minute, records managers see much more information here. The amount of information in group headings uses standard M-Files configurations and permissions, so it's completely configurable as to what is seen and who sees it. Let's go ahead and finish creating this document and get it checked into M-Files. The important thing to notice here is that Kimberly isn't making decisions about what retention policy will apply to this document. With AutoRecords, she doesn't even need to know what the policies are. Now we're going to check in another document for our demo. This time, Kimberly has received a parental leave application that needs to be filed for an employee. Again, she will check in this document and assign appropriate metadata without any need for her to worry about retention policies that will be applied behind the scenes. With that document checked in, Kimberly's work for the day is done. So let's switch over and take a look at these documents from a records manager's perspective. When I sign in as Dwayne Parkinson, I will have access to all of the AutoRecords features because I'm a records manager. Records manager permissions are granted using standard M-Files security features, so we have a great deal of flexibility to accommodate the needs of each organization. If I look at one of the documents that were just checked in, we can see that there are more AutoRecords properties that will eventually tell me how AutoRecords is treating this document. Currently, none of the values are filled in because AutoRecords runs as a scheduled job on the dates and times specified by the organization. As a records manager, I also have the ability to initiate an AutoRecords run at any time. This is really handy when configuring and testing new rules so you can quickly validate those configurations. So let's run AutoRecords right now and let it figure out what these documents are and what we should do with them. Once AutoRecords is done running, the metadata for our documents will be updated with information that will tell us how the document is going to be processed. Taking a look at the parking restrictions document, we can see that it has been assigned to a retention category of 300, which applies a policy that will delete the file 2 years after the expiration date. If we look at the events scheduled for the document, we can see that there's an event to delete the file 2 years after expiration, but it isn't triggered yet. In other words, it hasn't been scheduled yet because the expiration date hasn't been set. At some point, Kimberly or any number of people may set the expiration date for this document. AutoRecords will respond to that change and calculate when to schedule this event. For the sake of the demo, I'll set the date here. It's worth noting that AutoRecords has multiple ways to evaluate dates. This retention policy is configured to schedule the event based on the date we set in the expiration date property. We could also schedule the event based on when that date changes rather than its value. So let's set the date, and then we'll rerun AutoRecords and let it schedule this event. When AutoRecords runs, it will search the history of all changes in M files that have happened since the last time it ran. It determines whether any of those changes may affect the retention events that are scheduled, and it adjusts those schedules accordingly. In this case, the expiration date has been set, so an event can now be scheduled to perform the appropriate disposition against this document. If we were to change the date again, AutoRecords would reschedule this event again. Using the M-Files 360-degree view, we can begin to explore this document to see the records management objects that have been attached to it. We can see that there's an auto classification rule, and that tells us how AutoRecords assign the retention category. We'll get into how those rules work in just a moment. We can also see there's a retention category and a scheduled event linked to this document. Since the parking restrictions is a fairly straightforward example, let's look closer at some of these AutoRecords objects and see how they work. We'll look at the retention category first, since it's a glue that holds everything together. The retention category gets assigned to all documents AutoRecords is meant to manage. It's where the business defines what the retention policy is using IDs, labels, and descriptions. We can see here that AutoRecords supports things like vital reviewer and owners, which are important for some levels of compliance. Most importantly, it's also the thing that tells AutoRecords how it should treat documents that have been assigned to this retention category. The event template tells AutoRecords what to do for any document that has this retention category. Think of it as telling the system what we plan to do when we encounter one of these documents. So in this case, the plan is to delete the document 2 years after expiration. Now if we look at the actual event that's scheduled for our parking restriction document, we can see that AutoRecords has carried out that plan and scheduled the event for 2 years after the expiration date. This event tells us the trigger date, which was used for calculating the retention, and also the date of the scheduled event. We can also see that this event is actually an event group. What that means is that any other standard documents with the same expiration date will be attached to this single event. AutoRecords can be configured to have separate events scheduled for each document, or it can group documents together to share scheduled events. For example, if you have 10,000 invoices that get deleted at the end of the year, there can be a single event to manage all 10,000 invoices instead of creating and managing 10,000 separate events. Now let's go back and take a look at the auto classification rule associated with this document. When we look at the rule, we can see that it has a retention category. This is the retention category that will be assigned to any objects on the system that meet the criteria below. For standard documents, our rule is simple. If the class is document and it's been modified since January 1st of 1900, it will be assigned the retention category of 300. To understand the role of triggers a little better, let's look at the parental leave application. A trigger can also be thought of as a filter. The term trigger is commonly used in records management software to indicate when a set of criteria has been met. When we expand the relationships to our document and look at the auto classification rule, we see that the rule applies retention category 115 to employee documents. Additionally, it will only apply to documents that meet the criteria specified in the trigger. So only employee documents that have an employee document type equal to parental leave application will be assigned to retention category 115. We can also specify multiple trigger criteria using any metadata on the system and get some very precise auto classification rules. Another interesting thing about the parental leave application is that when we look at the AutoRecords information, we see a little more complex style of retention. AutoRecords has the ability to apply retention in a number of ways. This includes chaining events together and having multiple retention policies applied to the same object simultaneously. Looking at the retention category, we see that this file will be retained 8 years or the duration of employment plus 7 years, whichever is longer. This is an example of a little more complex configuration compared to a simple calculation after an expiration date. There is also something called indirect retention applied to this document. Indirect retention is a powerful feature in AutoRecords that allows the retention of a document to be calculated indirectly based on the status of some linked objects in M-files. In this case, we have indirect retention based on the status of an employee. 25 years after the employee becomes a former employee, this document would be deleted. Now, since retention category 115 is also based on employment status and is processed after only 7 years, it will always take precedence. However, the indirect retention rule is there as a catch-all to ensure that all employee-related documents will always have some kind of retention applied and nothing will ever slip through the cracks. If documents like the parental leave application require a unique retention policy that's different from the global 25-year employee policy, that can be applied simultaneously, and in this case, whichever condition is met first will be processed. Importantly, while the retention activity is happening, we have not interfered with the business processes that may also be in progress. Currently, this document is going through the employee document review workflow, and that business process is untouched by AutoRecords. Finally, there's one more property I'd like to point out on this document. You'll notice there's a hold property here. Putting documents on a legal hold is done by selecting from the available active holds. When a document is on hold, AutoRecords will not perform processing against it. Also, a single document can have multiple holds at once. Each hold has an expiration date, and once all of the holds for a document have expired, AutoRecords will process the document as it normally would. Using expiration dates means that holds don't need to be removed from documents, and that makes it easy for records managers to track historically the impact the hold may have had on a document. Now that we've seen a little bit of AutoRecords assigning retention, let's discard these changes and take a look at how a records manager configures the system. We'll go back to the home screen and find the AutoRecords view. Access to this view is controlled by M-Files permissions. As we explore the view, we'll start to see features a records manager will use to manage the system. A very important feature of AutoRecords is that it enables records managers to configure retention policies without ever needing access to the M-Files administration utilities. All AutoRecords configurations are stored as objects in the M-Files repository, so we can use standard M-Files features like views and searches to manage our entire system. As a result, permissions can also be assigned to the configuration objects in any number of ways that are necessary to meet organizational requirements. Let's start our tour of configurations with a quick overview of what our records managers need to configure. Starting at the top of our menu, auto classification rules are used to assign retention to documents based on the document class and metadata. Retention categories are the definition of the retention policy that tells AutoRecords what to do with documents that have been assigned to a retention category. Event templates are used by retention categories to specify how the document should be processed. And then triggers, periods, and actions are used by event templates to determine the what, when, and how of AutoRecords. What qualifies for processing, when should it be processed, and how should it be processed. We've already looked at auto classification rules briefly, but let's take another look at some of these rules. Looking at the parental leave application, you'll recall it assigns retention category 115 to all employee documents where the employee document type is parental leave application. If we look at W4 and W9, we can see a very common use of auto classification rules. Each of these rules are set up to handle different types of employee documents. The result is that documents will get assigned to different retention categories based on the metadata property of employee document type. What this means for the records manager is that the retention policy for the document is reliable, rule-driven, and based entirely on the metadata of the document. End users don't even need to be aware of the file plan or records management policies. Going back to our configuration view, the remaining items all tie together. Retention categories specify an event template, and the event template specifies periods, triggers, and actions. So let's start with retention categories and drill in from there. Looking at our retention categories, there's no limit to the number of retention categories you can have. Let's look again at category 115. It contains labels, descriptions, owner, reviewer, and most importantly, the AutoRecords event template. Since AutoRecords uses M-Files objects and maintains relationships between those objects, as a records manager, we can use the M-Files 360-degree view to quickly understand how and where this retention category is being used. In this case, we only have a single document assigned to this retention category. However, if we look at the W4, we can see many documents and 8 events have been scheduled. As we expand the events, we can see that the W4 looks to be using group events to remove obsolete documents from our system. This is a good example of how a few events can manage many documents. Now if we go back to the retention category 115, we can see there's an event template associated with the retention category. As we expand that, we see the related objects, but let's look at the configuration for this event template and understand what it means. Remember, an event template is telling AutoRecords how we plan to manage documents. So let's look at this event template and see what the plan is. Starting at the top, you can see that we plan to only schedule this event once the employment type is equal to former employee. Once that criteria is met, we plan to wait 7 end of years, and we'll talk about what that means in a second. Then finally, after that time period, we plan to perform an action to delete all revisions and destroy the metadata. Abstracting from this example, we discover the concept that is at the core of AutoRecords processing. After some criteria has been met, wait some period of time, then perform some action. And each of these is configurable to allow incredible flexibility for the records manager. So let's take a closer look at this, starting with the action template. AutoRecords is a records management framework, and it comes with a set of actions that are most commonly used in records management implementations. However, new action templates can be created to meet the unique needs of each organization. All action templates are implemented as workflows in mFiles, and since mFiles workflow allows fully customizable programming, an organization can create AutoRecords action templates to perform virtually any task. For example, you can see here that multiple actions can be performed by a single event. Perhaps in addition to delete all revisions and destroy metadata, our organization decides to implement a new action called delete parental leave application from HR management system. Now, AutoRecords not only deletes the content stored in mFiles, but it issues an API call to the HR system to remove the associated record. This powerful ability to extend AutoRecords so it can perform processes that are unique to the organization makes it possible to mold AutoRecords to fit internal processes rather than trying to force the internal processes to fit a software solution. When it comes time for AutoRecords to perform an action, such as deleting a document, it will create an action object on the system that gets sent through workflow to perform the work. The action object retains a configurable amount of information about the document that was being processed. For example, it can preserve just the ID of the object, or it can save the name along with a dozen other bits of metadata. The action object can be preserved on the system for auditing purpose or exported to a database for reporting. Below the action template, we have two properties that allow Records Manager to determine how long events and actions that have been completed should remain on the system. Often these events and actions are exported into archival databases for auditing and then removed from mFiles. However, exact auditing requirements vary per implementation, so as with everything else in AutoRecords, the amount of data preserved for auditing is configurable. Now that we know what action this event will perform, let's look at the period. The period is the amount of time to wait after the trigger criteria is met before we perform the action. The period object is very straightforward. We simply specify a period duration as an integer and a unit of time. You can see we've implemented days, weeks, months, years, but then we also have something called end of years, end of months, end of weeks, end of fiscal years. The end of years functionality means that we start counting our time at the end of the year the criteria was met instead of immediately after the criteria was met. So in this case, we have 7 end of years. Let's go back and look at our event. What's going to happen here is that once the employment type is equal to former employee, the document now qualifies for disposition. If we were using 7 standard years, the clock would start ticking the moment the employment type changed. By using end of years, the clock doesn't start ticking until we get to the end of the year. If we have an employee whose status changes in February and another whose changes in December, both start counting at the same time at the end of the year. Looking at our retention category, we see our goal is to retain these documents for 8 years or the duration of employment plus 7 years. While I could have chained several events together, instead I've chosen to implement this by using the end of years functionality. Now whenever an employee changes status at the end of that year, the clock starts ticking, and the minimum amount of time that we will retain information is 8 years, regardless of whether their status changes in February or December. Finally, let's look at triggers. AutoRecords' ability to set trigger criteria on any metadata, including selection lists, text fields, integers, and dates, provides a records manager with an incredibly robust set of tools that ensures virtually any file plan can be implemented with no special coding, scripts, or workflows. Remember, triggers define criteria for both auto-classification rules and events to get scheduled, so the flexibility in determining criteria creates tremendous flexibility in the overall system. Now let's go back to the configuration menu and take a look at some of the triggers that have been set up. As you can see, our demo system relies on triggers that are based on dates and property values. Let's look at our expiration date trigger and see how that works. AutoRecords has multiple ways to trigger from a date. This type of simple date trigger is most common. It becomes valid when the date value for the property specified in the trigger is less than or equal to the current date. So when the expiration date is less than or equal to the current date, this trigger criteria will be met. To get an idea of all the options that are available to us for triggers, let's go through the process of creating a trigger. Again, AutoRecords configurations are all standard mFiles objects, so there's no learning curve in terms of how to create these configurations. When we create a trigger, you can see that there are 4 different classes of triggers. The date trigger we've already looked at. The file version trigger is used when you want to maintain a set number of revisions for a document in the system. For this trigger, you simply tell it the number of revisions to keep. Any revisions beyond that number will get removed. We'll come back to indirect triggers in a moment. For now, let's take a look at the property trigger. This type of trigger allows a records manager to select any metadata property in the system and compare the value of the property to a value the records manager specifies. For example, we can create a trigger where the name or title has a substring of invoice. Now obviously this is not best practice, but in cases where the files are stored on a network share with virtually no metadata, it may be our best option if we're trying to create a trigger for an auto classification rule that is looking at ERP documents stored on the network shares. Likewise, we can create a property trigger over a date, which will behave differently than our standard date trigger. AutoRecords has several functions that perform simple date arithmetic. For example, let's configure this trigger for the last modified date and set it to less than. Now we could put in at current date here for a simple date comparison, but we can also use at current date minus period. When we use that function, we can add the property of period and specify 10 years. And what we've got now is a trigger that will be valid when a document hasn't been modified in the last 10 years. Triggers can also be set up to compare against values in selection lists. If we look at our employee document type equal to parental leave application, it shows how these types of triggers can be created. Finally, we have indirect triggers. If we create an indirect trigger, we can see that it looks very similar to a property trigger, but it has some additional properties that allow us to specify relation information to other objects. These are fairly advanced and I won't spend a lot of time on them other than to say they're here, they're well documented, and they're really useful for organizations that use mFiles object relationships for things like projects, clients, and departments. Going back to the configuration menu now, we briefly covered everything here, and I know it was a lot to take in, but the main things to remember are that records managers configure the system by creating objects in mFiles, and AutoRecords has been architected to be incredibly flexible, configurable, and extensible. With the time we have left, I'll quickly touch on a few other items in the AutoRecords view. Under configurations, we have holds. On this system, we have one hold that expires on 12/31/2021. Creating a new hold is done using the mFiles menu, and since a hold is an mFiles object, applying restrictions to who can create holds is done using mFiles permissions. Holds get applied directly to documents, and as a records manager, that allows us to use the mFiles 360-degree view to expand the hold and see which documents are affected by it. Currently, we have 3 documents which are not being processed by AutoRecords due to this hold. Once the hold expires, they will be processed normally. Beneath holds, we have scheduled events. Since all AutoRecords events are objects on mFiles, we can build views over those objects to give visibility to those events. For example, it becomes very easy to see what events are scheduled in the next 7 days. The views here are just a few examples, and new views can be created to meet the needs of the organization. Below scheduled events, we have something called retention conflicts. Earlier in the demo, I said that AutoRecords is a platform for delivering records management capabilities. It doesn't force an organization to fit its processes to some preconceived notion of how records management ought to be done. Providing organizations with such flexibility also opens up the possibility that those organizations might create situations where a document that's supposed to be deleted is currently checked out. Now there are best practices around this, and AutoRecords can be used to restrict access to documents at certain points to prevent this, but it's not required. In the end, any conflicts are logged and AutoRecords will try to clear them up the next time it runs. The next item is Disposition Actions. These are the objects AutoRecords has created to perform some work. The number of actions on the system at any time is based on the setting in the event templates that determines how long to keep them around after they're completed. As you can see here, any actions that require some kind of manual intervention and aren't done yet will also be visible here. If we look at one of the actions, we see the type of information it has. The purpose of the action is to preserve details about the work that AutoRecords has performed. From an auditing perspective, we see what event was done, when it was done, and when the action will be removed from the system. Most importantly, the action logging contains a configurable amount of metadata from the object that was being processed. This allows a records manager to specify exactly what will be available for auditing purposes. The information from the action can be used to generate audit logs necessary for compliance. Now going back to our view one last time, the final option here is physical records. We can manage physical records in M-Files by representing them with non-document objects. In our demo system, if I look at physical record data and then choose backup tapes from 2019, we can see that we have a backup tape class with some storage location, a retention category, scheduled events, and other metadata to support management of the physical records such as barcodes and statuses. So even though we have boxes of tapes somewhere in storage, those physical records are managed using M-Files objects, versioning, and workflows together with AutoRecords. With that, we come to the end of this high-level demo of AutoRecords. While there's a lot more to the product and we covered a lot of features in a hurry, I'm hoping the demo gives you an idea of how AutoRecords works to deliver enterprise records management capabilities for M-Files.